There are a lot of people that complain video games have gotten way too easy, that the gamer has become too soft in recent years, but there's some pretty recent stuff out there that'll knock you out, just like Mama said. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on Game Ranks, 10 of the hardest games from the last 5 years. Starting off with number 10, it's The Lies of P, which came out this year. The thing about Souls-likes is they're never usually as unforgiving as the games their subgenre takes its namesake from, but not Lies of P. This game wants to be the next Bloodborne, but it's kind of like Bloodborne crosses Sekiro. It's Bloodborne if you took everything about that game and threw it out the window. Bloodborne had a relatively generous dodge window, so Lies of P, hey, guess what? That's about useless. Bloodborne had healing items, and Lies of P, I guess, does, but they're really limited. I also hope you like parrying enemies that are often unpredictable and attack in strange patterns. Oh yeah, and your weapons degrade every time you miss a perfect parry, which, by the way, this game doesn't play around with in terms of timing. Some of the bosses totally brutal too. Even when the game gives you a free helper, they end up being mostly worthless a lot of the time. And the majority of the bosses have multiple stages. Like, most of the bosses are 2 fights in one, which gets a little absurd after a while. The combat is well designed and feels really good. Like, these guys really know what they're doing. And it's not one of those games that's a lot harder than the designers intended. They intended it. They wanted us to suffer here. Well, maybe not so much anymore. They did apparently patch it in a way that allows you to play it a lot easier, but I didn't play that version. I played the release version, which was very hard. At number 9 is Returnal. I could have easily made an entire list of roguelikes, but that feels a bit like cheating here. I mean, the whole point of that genre is that the games are so hard you'll have to make multiple runs in order to master the mechanics, and if the game is feeling generous, unlock upgrades and power-ups that make later runs easier. Returnal does have a little of that, but compared to something like Hades that gives you a steady stream of persistent upgrades, Returnal mostly just hands you some weapon unlocks and traversal powers and calls it a day. What makes Returnal so unusual is that it looks like a big-budget first-party game, but plays more like an old-school shooter. You run around at, frankly, pretty high speeds, dodging bullet hell, projectile patterns, and blasting away at really mobile enemies. It's a relentless game that is also pretty long for a roguelike, so fatigue can also be an issue. Any game that requires a high level of focus over a long time is asking a lot from players, and eventually your brain is going to shut down. And that's when mistakes are made. It's a tough game all around that requires a highly dedicated player to get through it. At number 8 is Ghost Runner, an indie FPS from 2020. It's kind of like if you combine Hotline Miami with Doom Eternal. Like, basically super hot without the time stop mechanic. Even with the ability to completely stop time, super hot is a pretty damn tough game. So imagine what it's like playing this. There is a lot of dying, there's just no other way to put it. Technically, you can slow down time leading up to performing a perfect dodge move, but it's difficult to get a lot of utility out of this thing in the heat of combat, and all it takes is one stray bullet to take you down permanently. It's not a roguelike. Enemy layouts are always the same, so at least at first, you're mostly relying on memorization to get you through encounters. Until a certain point, the whole thing kind of starts to click. Yeah, death is still omnipresent, but the game does get easier after a while. So then they start throwing the real bullshit at you. Ghost Runner is one of those games you just have to get used to dying a lot. It's part of the game. But at least the loading times are nice and fast. And number 7 is Elden Ring. You can't really have a list like this without mentioning Elden Ring. Came out in 2022, and it's a massive landmark success, but also brutally difficult. The open world aspect does neuter the difficulty in some ways compared to Souls-likes in the past, but that also gives the game more opportunities to throw ultimately unfair bullshit at you. From the difficulty wall that is the first real boss, Margaret, the Foul Omen, to From's most absurdly difficult boss yet, Melania, the game it pulls no punches. For players who got stuck on Margaret for hours at the start of the game, you'd think it couldn't get any harder, but Elden Ring actually escalates the difficulty as the game goes on. All the hardest fights are saved for near the end. It's funny to think about now, but before the game came out, people were actually worried the developers were trying to go too mainstream with this, and that it'd be too easy compared to past games. And I guess in some ways you could say it kind of is, but in all the ways that matter, it's really not. Yeah, the game saves some of its most depraved cruelties for optional areas, but this is a Souls game. Just calling something optional isn't going to stop someone from wasting hours of their life going through the miserable hero's tombs anyway. The open world aspect does make it a little more forgiving because you can just leave and go somewhere else at any given point, and the ability to summon little helper guys at any time can make the bosses easier, but overall it's a really, really hard game that doesn't pull punches. At number 6 is Celeste, a kinder, gentler Super Meat Boy. The presentation makes this seem like a standard cloying indie game, but the gameplay is about as hardcore as it can possibly get. It starts off easy enough in the first world, but the difficulty just keeps escalating with increasingly brutal precision platforming challenges. This is a cruel game, to say the least. But instead of kicking you while you're down, the game does you solid and tries to be encouraging. Like, the way it lists your deaths, instead of presenting it like you're a loser who dies a lot, the game tries to frame your losses as a monument to your perseverance. At the end of the day, that's fully an aesthetic difference, completely just how it's presented, but for some reason, this game is considered a good gateway game for people who want to try out more challenging games. It is merciless, though. Unless you've been weaned on a diet of Kaizo Mario levels, which not everybody has, then this game is going to kill you a whole lot. At number 5, Baba Is You from 2019. It's not just action games and platformers that can be excruciatingly tough. Depending on how good your brain works, puzzle games can actually be the hardest games. I love a good puzzle game now and then. I 100%ed The Witness with some minor bumps along the way, but Baba Is You it's another level. The game is about manipulating rules. What starts off as a clever little word puzzle turns into this introductory course on programming, and I'm not exaggerating a lot. I may not be exaggerating at all, I don't know. But these puzzles go really hard, and there are a hell of a lot of them. Even as a fairly experienced puzzle gamer, I can only get so far with this one. The amount of brain power required for every single puzzle, it can be too much at a certain point. For the people who love these types of games, or the guys who can play Zachtronics games and describe any of them as easy, I'm sure this isn't as insurmountable as it is for normies like myself. But for us, it might as well be impossible, guys. At number 4, Sifu from 2022, a roguelike action game with some of the most intense, hard-hitting combat of like any game. It's massively unforgiving, and it really punishes any mistake that you make viciously, and it's really what makes the game so good. The gimmick is that you run through multiple beat-em-up stages in sequence, but if you die, and that's gonna happen a lot, at least at first, you come back to life instantly, but your age increases. If you get too old, you drop dead, so you either go back to the start of the level and try to avoid taking too much damage, or most likely just restart the entire run. The game never changes between runs, so the entire experience is about gaining mastery over the level layouts and combat system. What makes the combat so tough, though, is you gotta parry and also 2 different dodges. A hop to avoid low attacks and a duck to avoid high ones. Enemies very fast and bosses absolutely relentless. Just learning when and where to dodge is a huge part of the game. When everything is going well, you feel like a non-stop flurry of violence, like a Jackie Chan, a Jet Li, or a Donnie Yen, or rather, all of them rolled into one, but all it takes is one bad hit and suddenly the failures start to cascade. It's a game that could have easily been made without any roguelike enemies, but the challenge really does benefit the combat system. The only way to beat this game is to truly master it. At number 3 is Darkest Dungeon 2, which came out in 2021 in early access. The original Darkest Dungeon was tough, but this one, it's it's arguably worse. It is debatable that the sequel really is tougher than the original, because the original is crazy hard, but what isn't debatable is that this game is hard as hell either way. There are a few reasons for that. Healing is overall less generous than in the first, and you start off weaker than you did in the original game as well. Yeah, you can't randomly miss anymore, but by making the combat more deterministic, they got away with making it harder. The death protection kicks in less often without getting necessary upgrades, so you're losing guys a lot more often early on. Apparently, it was even worse in early access. They made it easier when the final game came out, but it's still an incredibly unforgiving experience.
Empowered, emboldened.
And number 2 is Spelunky from 2020, the crowning king of the hard as hell roguelikes. Spelunky 2 took the absurd difficulty of the original game and told it to hold its beer. What makes these games so difficult is the high level of randomization combined with the utter lethality of pretty much everything. It's not just that getting hit by a spear trap will hurt you, it's that it'll fling you into a snake or a spike trap, or you'll slip or drop a necessary tool, and if that happens, you're doomed. The sudden randomness of death is one of those things that makes Spelunky 2 a fun game to laugh about, but it's also really frustrating, especially when it's so hard that just getting through the first biome is a struggle. Seriously, as someone who did complete the first game without a whole lot of issues, it took forever to just get used to the sequel's first area, the dwelling, and it only gets worse from there. Spelunky 2 is kind of a Lost Levels type sequel, a game that's designed to challenge people who mastered the first game and screw everyone else over. And I'm sure the dozen or so people who got good at Spelunky loved it, just like, damn game, give me a break here. And at number 1 is Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice, arguably From Software's hardest game. What makes Sekiro so tough is that it absolutely requires players to master its parry system. If you can't do that, you are not finishing the game. Or at least, if you can, it's going to be the biggest pain in the ass. I certainly did not finish it without getting good at parrying, because the game's just designed around it. The timing is super tight, enemies attack in all kinds of hard to predict, even harder to time patterns, and it only takes a few mistakes to die. Yes, you can come back to life, but in a game this difficult, it doesn't really matter. There's times where this game actually kind of is forgiving. Certain areas can be cleared out without having to directly engage with any enemies at all. You can grapple around and sneak attack everyone in sight for an easy victory, but bosses are where this game is just like no mercy whatsoever. A lot has been said about how absurdly difficult the last boss is, and that's true because the final boss is insanely hard, maybe From's most challenging boss of all time, but the rest of the game, it's no joke. To put that into perspective, though, even the people who think the rest of the game isn't that bad often think the last boss is too hard. If Sekiro is on another level from most games, the final boss is on another level from the rest of Sekiro. It's a game that either clicks, you get the parry timing down, or it doesn't, and it's basically impossible to finish. It's super brutal, super cruel, completely unforgiving, but damn, does it feel good when you beat a boss that you've been struggling with for hours. I'll throw a bonus at you as well. Fear and Hunger from 2018. There's hard games and then there's masochist simulators. And then there's Fear and Hunger, one of the cruelest RPGs ever made. So much of this game is a literal flip of the coin. Oh, heads, you're okay. Tails? Sorry, you're dead. It's an obtuse, baffling game where all it takes is one wrong move and you don't have legs and you're doomed. It's a game that's designed to be as confusing and difficult as a game can be without being literally impossible to finish. I mean, maybe it is impossible to finish. I don't know. I haven't finished it. I cannot get past the first door. All those Let's Plays and wikis are like an elaborate prank, I think, to make people think the game is possible to beat. We can agree on that, right? Joking aside, the sequel is a lot more forgiving. That's to say, it's only extremely difficult rather than nearly impossible. If you like to suffer in games for whatever reason, often in extremely juvenile ways, this is the game for you. And that's all for today. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. The best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. So click subscribe. Don't forget to enable notifications. And as always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero. And we'll see you next time right here on Game Ranks.